The August sun beat down on the town of Rockemont with a merciless, white-hot intensity. It was the kind of heat that silenced birds and drove people indoors, leaving the cobbled streets shimmering and deserted. For Alessandro Vescovi, an engineer from Rome, the stillness was unnerving. He wiped a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his crisp shirt already clinging unpleasantly to his skin. He stood before his charge, the Chapel of the Silent Vow, a structure that was less a building and more a stone skeleton picked clean by time. Commissioned by the diocese nearly a century ago and abandoned before its completion, it was a local ghost story made of limestone and regret. The diocese now, in a sudden fit of utilitarianism in 1921, wanted it assessed. If structurally sound, it would be converted into a storehouse. If not, demolished. Alessandro was there to read its bones. Two local men, Marco and Enzo, were waiting for him by the boarded-up entrance, their faces weathered like the very stone they were hired to work on. Marco, the elder of the two, nodded grimly. "Ingegner. The air is better outside." "It's just an old building, Marco," Alessandro replied, his voice betraying a city dweller's impatience with rural superstition. He produced a large iron key, provided by the parish office, and worked it into the rusted lock. The door groaned open, releasing a wave of cool, musty air that smelled of damp earth and decay. Inside, the scale of the failure was magnificent. A cavernous nave stood unfinished, stone arches soaring up to meet nothing. The sky was visible through the exposed timber ribs of a roof that was never slated. Pigeons had made a home in the high alcoves, their cooing echoing strangely in the vast space. Light streamed in through empty window frames, illuminating dancing columns of dust. On one wall, the faint outline of a fresco, a saint's face, serene and sorrowful, was peeling away, a fading memory of forgotten piety. "They say a blight fell upon the work," Enzo whispered, making a subtle sign against evil. "The money dried up, and the bishop who ordered it died of a fever. They sealed it and never looked back." Alessandro ignored him, his trained eye scanning the masonry. He ran his hand along the main northern wall, a vast, unbroken expanse of stone that should have led to a transept. It was well constructed, the mortar still solid. He was there to check for weaknesses, for cracks, for the subsidence that plagued these hillside towns. He paced its length, tapping it methodically with a small geological hammer. Solid, 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 thud, he stopped. The sound was different. Duller, with less resonance, as if the stone was thicker here or backed by something other than more stone. He tapped again. Thud, thud. A patch, roughly 3 meters wide and extending from the floor upwards, sounded wrong. He peered closer. The masonry was subtly different. The mortar a slightly lighter shade. The stones set with a precision that was almost too perfect, lacking the minor imperfections of the surrounding wall. "Marco, bring the large hammer and a chisel," Alessandro commanded, his professional curiosity piqued. "I want to see what's behind this section. It feels like a poorly executed repair, but there are no records of any structural work after it was abandoned." Marco exchanged a nervous glance with Enzo. "Ingegner, perhaps it's best to leave old walls alone." "It is my job not to leave them alone," Alessandro stated firmly. "If this section is hollow or filled with rubble, it could be a fatal weakness for the entire structure. Now, please." Reluctantly, Marco retrieved the tools. The clang of the hammer against the chisel was brutally loud in the chapel's silence, each strike echoing like a gunshot. Dust and chips of mortar flew. After 10 minutes of arduous work, the chisel broke through into a void. A puff of dry, stale air hissed out, carrying with it a peculiar smell. It wasn't the simple dampness of an enclosed space. It was acrid and faintly sweet, like old leather and dried flowers. "A light," Alessandro said, his voice tight. Enzo fumbled with a lantern, the flame flickering as he brought it near the hole. Alessandro peered inside, his eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. At first, he saw nothing but blackness. Then, as the lantern's glow penetrated deeper, a shape began to resolve itself. It was pale, shrouded in what looked like coarse brown fabric. He could make out the form of a hand, fingers curled inward, the skin a dry, leathery brown, perfectly preserved. Alessandro recoiled, stumbling back a step. His heart hammered against his ribs. Dio mio, what is it? Enzo asked, his voice trembling. Alessandro couldn't form the words. He grabbed the lantern himself, thrusting it closer to the opening, his earlier professionalism utterly shattered and replaced by a cold, primal horror. It wasn't rubble. It wasn't a hollow space. Inside the wall, seated upright as if in silent meditation, was the mummified body of a young man in a friar's habit. His head was bowed, his face obscured by a cowl, and as Alessandro moved the light, he saw another form seated beside the first, and another next to that. He lowered the lantern, his hand shaking uncontrollably. The strange, dull sound wasn't from a repair. It was the sound of a wall filled not with stone, but with bodies. The dust motes hung in the lantern's beam, a silent, golden snow falling on the dead. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, the only sound was the harsh, ragged breathing of the three men. The dry, cloying scent of ancient dust, desiccated flesh, and forgotten linen filled the air, a perfume of the grave that choked the throat. Marco, his face the color of wet parchment, stumbled back, crossing himself repeatedly, his lips moving in a frantic, silent prayer. Enzo, a boy of no more than 19, stood frozen, his hammer dangling from a limp hand, his young eyes wide with a horror that had not yet found a voice. Alessandro felt his own heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. His engineer's mind, usually a fortress of logic and calculation, was reeling. He had expected to find decaying mortar, perhaps a hidden structural buttress. Not this. Not a silent congregation of the dead, entombed and forgotten. He forced a breath into his lungs, the foul air burning. In diatro, he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly thing he barely recognized. Marco, Enzo, back away, now. His order broke the spell. Enzo dropped his hammer with a clatter that echoed unnaturally in the vast, unfinished nave. Marco, needing no further encouragement, practically scrambled away from the opening, his gaze still fixed on the darkness within as if fearing the figures might stir. Alessandro took another step forward, raising his lantern higher. The first novice, the one seated directly before the breach, seemed to stare back at him, his face a taut mask of preserved skin over bone, his mouth slightly agape. Beyond him, the beam picked out other shapes. Another seated figure to his left, then another. Rows of them. They were all dressed in the same simple, dark habits, their hands resting in their laps, some clutching rosary beads whose wooden texture was still visible. They were not piled carelessly but arranged, seated on what looked like low stone benches, facing inward as if in a chapter meeting that had been interrupted a century ago. How many? Alessandro murmured to himself. He needed to know. He needed data. Numbers were solid. Numbers were sane. He turned to his men. Enzo, fetch the other lanterns from the truck. Marco, stay here. Don't touch anything. Marco just nodded, his eyes wide, looking at Alessandro as if he were a madman for wanting to see more. Enzo, grateful for a task that took him away from the tomb, sprinted out of the chapel, his footsteps echoing into the oppressive afternoon heat. When he returned minutes later with 2 more powerful lanterns, the full, ghastly tableau was revealed. Alessandro took one and carefully positioned it on the rubble-strewn floor, angling its beam deep into the cavity. He took the other and stepped onto the pile of dislodged stones, holding it aloft. One by one, the silent figures emerged from the gloom. They sat in 3 neat rows, facing each other, 7 per row, 21. The number struck Alessandro with the force of a physical blow. Not a random burial, not a collapsed cellar. This was deliberate, an assembly frozen in time. The masonry hadn't been a repair, it was a seal, a meticulously constructed final wall. Dio mio, Marco whispered from behind him, his fear now mingled with a profound, sorrowful awe. They are just boys. He was right. Beneath the mummified flesh, the bone structure was slight. They were young men, novices on the cusp of their vows, now prisoners in a tomb of their own church. Alessandro's mind snapped back to the present. This was no longer a structural survey. It was something else, a crime scene. "Enzo," he said, his voice firm, authoritative, "run to the village, find Marshal Vattimo of the Carabinieri. Tell him there has been a discovery at the chapel, a grave, and find Don Elio, the priest. Tell him to come at once." "Go." Enzo nodded, his face pale but resolute, and disappeared again. The wait was agonizing. Alessandro and Marco stood in silence, the three lanterns casting long, dancing shadows that made the chapel feel both immense and claustrophobic. The sun began its slow descent, painting the arched window openings with strokes of orange and purple, but no warmth reached the chapel's cold stone heart. Finally, the crunch of boots on gravel announced the arrival of the law. Marshal Vattimo was a stout man in his 50s, his uniform immaculate despite the dust and heat. His face was a study in practiced neutrality, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in the scene with a quick, assessing glance. The breached wall, the shaken worker, the grim-faced engineer from Rome. "Vescovi?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. "Marshal," Alessandro acknowledged, gesturing toward the opening. "See for yourself." Vattimo approached cautiously, peering into the lantern-lit tomb. The professional mask slipped for just a second, a flicker of disbelief and shock crossing his features before it was replaced by a grim resolve. He was silent for a long moment. "You have touched nothing?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over the seated figures. "Only the wall," Alessandro confirmed. Just then, a more fragile figure appeared in the chapel doorway, silhouetted against the dying light. Don Elio, the parish priest, was a man who seemed as ancient as the town itself, stooped and leaning heavily on a wooden cane. His breath came in shallow rasps as he made his way over, his old eyes blinking in the lantern light. The marshal made way for him respectfully. The priest stared into the tomb, and unlike the others, his reaction was not one of shock, but of immense, crushing sorrow. He closed his eyes, his weathered face crumpling, and made the sign of the cross. "So, the whispers were true," he murmured, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "The disgraziati, the unfortunate ones." He opened his eyes and looked at Alessandro, a deep, ancient pain swimming in their depths. "You have not uncovered a tomb, signor. You have uncovered a secret the devil himself helped to bury." The suffocating air in the tomb was replaced by the cold, methodical presence of Marshal Vattimo. He was a man carved from the same stone as the mountains that imprisoned Roccamont, his face a landscape of lines that spoke of harsh winters and little patience. He moved with an economy of motion, treating the chapel not as a holy place desecrated, but as a crime scene to be processed. His two carabinieri, young men with faces pale under their formal hats, stood guard at the breach, preventing anyone, including Alessandro's own workers, from getting closer. "Signor Vescovi," Vattimo began, his voice flat, devoid of the shock that still echoed in Alessandro's own mind. He had a small notebook out, the pencil looking like a twig in his thick fingers. "Let's go over it one more time. From the beginning." Alessandro, leaning against the cool outer wall of the chapel, recounted the events. He spoke of the survey, the hollow sound, the unusual mortar, the decision to break through. He was an engineer. He spoke in terms of acoustics, material integrity, and structural anomalies. He tried to keep the horror out of his voice, to present it as a sequence of logical discoveries. But when he described the first glimpse of the seated figure, his voice faltered. "And you are certain nothing was disturbed before my arrival?" Vattimo asked, his eyes never leaving Alessandro's face. "Nothing. Once we saw what was inside, I ordered my men back. We waited. I sent for you immediately." Vattimo grunted, a sound of reluctant acknowledgement. He then turned his attention to Don Elio, who had remained silent, his gaze fixed on the dark opening in the wall as if it were a wound in the earth itself. "Don Elio, you called them the unfortunate ones. That's not a phrase one uses for strangers." The old priest seemed to shrink under the marshal's directness. He wrung his hands, the leathered skin rustling softly. It is an old story, Marshall, a sadness that has seeped into the soil of this town. It is not a tale for official reports. A murder of 21 men is not a tale, it's a massacre, Vatimo countered, his voice sharp. If you know something, you are obligated to say it. I know only what was passed down, Don Leo whispered, his eyes pleading. Whispers, talk of a harsh winter, a failed brotherhood, a penance that went too far. The church archives, they might hold some records of the chapel's founding, of the men who came here to build it. He then looked at Alessandro, a flicker of something new in his tired eyes, perhaps a hope that this outsider, this man of logic, could unearth a truth the town had chosen to bury. The parish keeps records, Signor Vescovi. Sometimes paper remembers more clearly than people. By late afternoon, the news had slithered down the mountainside and coiled itself around the heart of Roccamont. As Vatimo and Alessandro walked back towards the small piazza, the change was palpable. The usual ambient noise of the town, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the chatter of women at the fountain, the laughter of children, was gone. There was only a heavy, watchful silence. Curtains twitched. Doors that had been open were now firmly shut. Faces vanished from windows as they approached. The workers Alessandro had hired were nowhere to be seen, having melted back into their homes, no doubt spreading the gruesome details in hushed, terrified tones. Alessandro felt like a carrier of a plague. The superstitions he had so easily dismissed that morning now felt like a physical barrier, a wall of fear erected between him and the townsfolk. His simple engineering contract was void, his work here finished. He should have been packing his bags, eager to leave this claustrophobic place behind. Yet the image of those 21 silent figures was burned into his mind. He couldn't leave. Not yet. His first logical step was to find the chapel's original plans. An official building, even an unfinished one, must have blueprints, documents filed with the municipal authorities. He found the town hall, a small, damp building that smelled of old paper and dust. The clerk, a man with a perpetually nervous expression, could barely meet his eyes. The Chapel of the Silent Vow? The clerk stammered, wiping his sweaty palms on his trousers. Ah, yes, a project from long ago, before my time. Before my father's time, even. There must be plans. Architectural drawings, construction permits, Alessandro insisted. The clerk scurried to a back room filled with towering stacks of ledgers bound in decaying leather. After a long, performative search, he returned empty-handed. I am sorry, Signor. There is nothing. It was an unofficial project, perhaps, funded by the diocese but managed by the Brotherhood themselves. The records, if they ever existed, are not here. It was another dead end, another door closed in his face. That evening, sitting alone in the corner of the town's only locanda, Alessandro nursed a glass of rough, red wine. The few other patrons huddled on the far side of the room, their conversations a low murmur that would cease whenever he shifted in his chair. The isolation was absolute. He was a foreign body that the town was trying to reject. But their fear, their secrecy, only fueled his resolve. They were hiding something far greater than a simple construction failure. Don Elio's words came back to him. Sometimes paper remembers more clearly than people. He finished his wine, the decision made. His search would not be in the sterile archives of the state, but in the dusty, forgotten records of the parish. He would face the town's ghosts, whether they were made of memory or of paper and ink. The air in the sacristy of Santa Maria Assunta was heavy with the scent of cold stone, lingering beeswax, and the faint, sweet smell of aged paper. Don Elio, looking even more fragile under the dim light filtering through a high stained glass window, beckoned Alessandro with a trembling hand. The archives are this way, Signor. A warning, they are not as ordered as your blueprints. He led Alessandro not into the main church, but to a small, stout oak door set deep into a wall behind the altar. The key he used was enormous, a piece of rusted iron that looked like it could have unlocked a medieval fortress. It turned in the lock with a groan of protest, the sound echoing in the hallowed silence. As the door swung inward, it released a cloud of dust and the musty breath of forgotten decades. Alessandro, a man of clean lines and precise calculations, felt like he was stepping into a physical manifestation of chaos. The room was small, windowless, and crammed from floor to ceiling with teetering stacks of leather-bound ledgers, loose bundles of documents tied with faded ribbon, and wooden crates overflowing with scrolls. It was a tomb of paperwork, a labyrinth of recorded life and death left to decay. Dust motes swirled like frantic spirits in the beam of Alessandro's oil lamp. "As you see," Donna Leo said, his voice a soft sigh of resignation. "A century of Rocamont secrets, all piled one atop the other. The bishops have been asking for an inventory for years." He made a vague, helpless gesture. Where does one even begin? For Alessandro, the answer was simple: with a system. "We need to find records pertaining to the chapel's construction. Anything from, say, 1870 to 1875. Financial outlays, construction plans, correspondence with the diocese." "Ah, the diocese," the priest murmured, his eyes distant. They were so proud of the project. A new beacon of faith in the mountains. For the next hour, they worked in a strange partnership. Alessandro, methodical and focused, carefully moved stacks, examining spines for dates and descriptions. Don Elio, guided by the whims of memory, would occasionally pull out a volume, his fingers tracing a familiar family name. "The Rossi family, they own the largest flock of sheep. Always generous at Easter," he'd say, before losing the thread and setting the book aside. It was clear the priest's knowledge was anecdotal, not archival. Alessandro's patience was wearing thin. The dust was beginning to coat his throat, and the disorganized heaps were an offense to his engineering sensibilities. He was about to suggest a more structured approach when his fingers brushed against a ledger that felt different. It was thicker than the others, bound in dark, supple leather, and tucked away on a low shelf as if hidden. There was no title on its spine. He pulled it out, resting the heavy volume on a crate and carefully opening it. The paper was brittle, the ink faded from black to a rusty brown. It wasn't a financial record. The columns were headed with names, dates of birth, and familial relations. It was a parish census, a detailed register of every soul in Rocamont. The first page was dated Anno Domini 1870. "Donna Leo, come look at this," Alessandro said, his voice low with excitement. He ran his finger down the pages, scanning the neat, cursive script. He passed lists of baptisms, marriages, and deaths, each entry a small, formal testament to a life lived. Then he found it. Tucked in the back, under a section titled Noviziato Monastero di San Francesco, was a new list. It began with an entry for the spring of 1871. His heart began to beat faster. He counted. There were 21 names. 21 young men, most between the ages of 16 and 20, all entered into the novitiate within a 3-month period. "It's them," he whispered. "It has to be them." He read a few names aloud. Giuseppe Nardi, Lorenzo Gallo, Matteo Costa. Donna Leo peered over his shoulder, his breath catching. The Gallo family. They had the mill by the river. I remember my mother speaking of them. They left Rocamont. A long time ago. But it wasn't the names that seized Alessandro's full attention. It was a small annotation at the bottom of the list. The handwriting was different, spidery, rushed, and filled with a palpable tension that contrasted sharply with the registrar's calm script. It was 2 words, written in Latin. Alessandro leaned closer, the lamplight flickering across the page. Clausi in silentio. He translated it under his breath. Closed in silence. Beneath the phrase was a date, stark and final, October 1873. Alessandro looked up at the priest. "Donna Leo, what does this mean? Closed in silence?" The old priest's face, already pale, turned the color of ash. His hand flew to his chest, his fingers fumbling for the crucifix tucked into his cassock. He stared at the words as if they were a serpent coiled on the page, his eyes wide with a terror that was not of the present, but of a memory unearthed. He began to tremble, backing away from the book. "The unfortunate ones," he whispered, the words choked with a fear so profound it silenced the room. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't have to. His reaction was a confession. Alessandro stared at the ledger, the Latin phrase searing itself into his mind. This wasn't just a record of death, it was the title page to a cover-up. The musty air in the archive felt thick enough to suffocate. Alessandro's fingers traced the spidery script of Clausi in Silentio, the Latin phrase stark against the mundane entries in the parish register. He looked at Donna Leo, whose face had drained of all color, leaving a waxy, parchment-like pallor. The old priest's hand trembled as he made the sign of the cross, his lips moving in a silent, desperate prayer. Donna Leo, Alessandro's voice was low but firm, cutting through the silence. What does this mean? Who wrote this? The priest flinched, pulling his gaze away from the book as if it were a venomous snake. It is nothing, he stammered, his voice a dry whisper. The scrawlings of a troubled mind, perhaps. This archive, it is full of such things. Forgotten notes. This is not a forgotten note, Alessandro countered, his patience wearing thin. He pointed to the list of 21 names. This is an epitaph, written 2 years after these boys entered the monastery. What happened to them? Donna Leo sank onto a nearby wooden stool, his frail body seeming to shrink. He wrung his hands, his eyes darting towards the door. Signor Vescovi, you are a man of science, of concrete and steel. You do not understand the foundations of a town like this. They are not built on stone, but on memory and on silence. Some stories are the mortar holding everything together. If you chip away at them, the whole structure can collapse. Whose structure, Donna Leo? Alessandro pressed, his voice rising slightly. The town's, or that of the people who put those boys in that wall? The priest looked up, his eyes filled with a profound, ancient fear. The Baron Bellucci funded the chapel's construction, he said, his voice barely audible. They were a powerful family. Their influence was absolute. They believed they were acting in God's name to preserve purity, to enforce a vow. He would say no more. He stood shakily, gestured for Alessandro to leave the book, and shuffled out of the archive, leaving the engineer alone with the chilling list of names. Gallo, Costa, Morty, Rinaldi. They weren't just names anymore. They were sons, brothers, and Clausi in Silentio was their only farewell. Frustrated but undeterred, Alessandro left the oppressive quiet of the church and stepped back into the blinding afternoon sun. The heat radiated from the cobblestones, and the air was thick with the scent of salt and drying fishing nets. He walked towards the main piazza, the social heart of Roccamont, the register's names echoing in his mind. He needed to find a crack in the wall of silence Donna Leo had described. In the piazza, a handful of old men sat in the shade of the single, sprawling olive tree, playing cards. A few women haggled at a small vegetable stall. As Alessandro approached, conversation faltered. All eyes turned to him, the outsider, the man who had disturbed the dead. He ignored their hostile stares and walked directly to the card players. "Scusate," he began, his tone polite but determined. "I am looking for information about the Gallo family, or the Costa family, from about 50 years ago." The men stared at him. The one holding the cards slowly placed them face down on the rickety table. His face was a mask of hardened leather and suspicion. "Never heard of them," he grunted, and picked up his cards again, a clear dismissal. Another man spat on the ground near Alessandro's feet. "We have no time for grave robbers here," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. A ripple of grim agreement passed through the piazza. The women from the stall began packing their things, casting dark looks his way. The message was unmistakable. He was not welcome. The wall was real, and it was impenetrable. Dejected, Alessandro retreated to a stone bench at the edge of the piazza, which overlooked the glittering, indifferent expanse of the Adriatic Sea. He felt the weight of the 21 silent voices pressing down on him. He had uncovered a crime, but the entire town was conspiring to keep it buried. As he sat there, lost in thought, a soft, raspy voice startled him. "They won't talk to you, Signor Ingegner. Their fear is older than their memory." He turned to see an elderly woman sitting at the far end of the bench. She was dressed in the traditional black of a widow, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her hands busy shelling fava beans into a clay bowl in her lap. She hadn't been in the main piazza group. She had been watching from the periphery. Alessandro looked at her, surprised. "You know what I'm asking about." She gave a slow, sad nod, not looking up from her task. "You are asking about the lost boys, the ones who went away." Her fingers paused. "My brother was one of them, Pietro Gallo." The name struck Alessandro like a physical blow. He finally had a connection, a human face to attach to the list. "What happened to him?" the priest said. "The priest says what he must to keep the peace," she interrupted, her voice low and conspiratorial. "They told us the boys were sent to a new, stricter monastery in the north, to complete their vows in total isolation. There were never any letters. My mother waited for a letter until the day she died." She finally looked at him, her dark eyes holding a lifetime of unresolved grief. "They didn't go anywhere, did they, Signor? You found them, in that chapel on the cliff." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of confirmed, long-held dread. Alessandro could only nod, his throat tight. "Be careful," she whispered, resuming her work as if the conversation had never happened. "The Bellucci name is not spoken of, but their blood still runs in this town. Some walls are built to keep things in. Others are built to keep people out. You are trying to break down both." The dim light of Sophia's kitchen cast long shadows across the worn wooden table, making the small space feel both intimate and conspiratorial. The air was thick with the scent of dried herbs and 50 years of unspoken grief. Alessandro leaned forward, his notebook open but his pen still. He looked at the elderly woman, her face a roadmap of hardship, and saw not a fragile relic, but a bastion of resilience. "The Bellucis," he said, his voice low. "You said to be wary of them. What were they like?" Sophia's gaze drifted to the small window towards the hills looming over Roccamont. "Like," she scoffed, a dry, bitter sound. "They were not like anything, Signor. They were Roccamont, the quarries, the farms, the shop on the piazza. Everything was touched by their gold, but it was a gilded cage." She turned back to him, her dark eyes sharp. "The patriarch, Lorenzo Bellucci, was a man carved from the mountain itself. Pious, he called it. Tyrannical, I say. He believed God spoke directly to him and that his wealth was proof of his righteousness. He demanded purity from everyone, a reflection of his own impossible standards." She described a town held in a vice grip of religious fervor, funded and enforced by one man. Lorenzo's wife, Isabella, was said to be even more devout, a wraith in black who saw sin in a child's laughter. "They funded the chapel, yes," Sophia continued, her voice trembling slightly. "It was to be their monument, a testament to their piety, but it was also a place for their discipline. Lorenzo believed that to spare the rod was to spoil the soul. He preached it from the steps of the main church, his words like stones." "And the novices?" Alessandro pressed gently. "My brother, Pietro?" Sophia's hands clenched in her lap. "He was a good boy, full of life, but Lorenzo Bellucci took a special interest in that group. He handpicked many of them from the poorest families, offering them a future, a path to God. My parents saw it as a blessing. A Bellucci patronage was a shield against starvation. We were fools." She pointed a trembling finger out the window. "Their villa is still up there, on the highest hill, of course, watching. It's mostly ruins now, but the family line. It isn't completely gone. Lorenzo's great-grandson lives there, a bitter man who clings to the last vestiges of their name." Armed with this new, chilling context, Alessandro thanked Sophia, his heart heavy with the weight of her story. He walked through the town, the Bellucci name now hanging in the air like a shroud. The directions were simple. Follow the old, crumbling stone path that wound its way up the steepest hill east of the town. The path was overgrown, forgotten by all but the wind and the rain. As he climbed, the air grew colder. The villa appeared through the skeletal trees, a ghost of its former glory. It was a large, imposing structure of stone, but windows were boarded up, and sections of the roof had collapsed, leaving gaping holes open to the sky. A thin plume of smoke, however, snaked from one of the few intact chimneys. Someone was home. He knocked on the massive oak door, the sound echoing unnervingly. After a long moment, bolts scraped and the door creaked open a few inches. A man in his late 40s, with a severe face and the same dark, intense eyes Sophia had described in Lorenzo, peered out. "What do you want?" he snapped, his voice rough. "Signor Bellucci?" Alessandro asked, maintaining a steady tone. "My name is Alessandro Vescovi. I'm the engineer overseeing the survey of the chapel." The man's eyes narrowed into slits. He made to close the door. "We have nothing to say about that place." Alessandro put a hand on the door, stopping it. "I believe you do. 21 boys were found there, boys from this town. Families like the Gallows deserve answers." At the mention of the name, a flicker of something, recognition, or perhaps anger, crossed Bellucci's face. He opened the door wider, a sneer twisting his lips. "You are the one stirring up the past. A past that was settled long ago. You come here, to my home, and speak of answers?" He stepped out onto the threshold, a man defending his crumbling kingdom. "My great-grandfather, Lorenzo, was a pillar of this community, a man of God. He built that chapel to save souls, not to answer to busybodies from Rome a half-century later." "He built it on a foundation of secrets," Alessandro countered, his voice rising with conviction. "The town is silent because they are afraid. Even now, what did your family do to them? What happened to those boys?" Marco Bellucci laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "They were weak. My great-grandfather believed in spiritual fortitude. He believed in silence, in penance. What happened in that chapel was between them and their God." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "This is not your affair, engineer. You have dug up bodies, that is all. Leave them be, leave Rockemont. Some stones are best left unturned, lest the entire mountain come down upon you." With that, Marco slammed the door shut, the finality of the sound like a gunshot in the silent, cold air. Alessandro stood alone on the decaying porch, the threat hanging between them. He now understood. The wall of silence wasn't just built on old grief. It was mortared with fear. A fear actively maintained by the last of the Bellucis, a man willing to protect a monstrous legacy at any cost. The heavy oak door of the presbytery groaned, open before Alessandro could knock. Don Leo stood there, his face etched with a familiar anxiety, as if he had been waiting. The cold dread from Marco Bellucci's villa still clung to Alessandro, a chilling premonition that silence was no longer a refuge, but a tomb in the making. "He threatened you," Don Leo stated, his voice a low whisper. It wasn't a question. Alessandro nodded, stepping inside. The small room felt suffocating. He spoke of his great-grandfather as a saint who protected this town from weakness. "He warned me that digging up the past would bury me." The priest's shoulders slumped, the weight of 50 years of silence finally crushing his resolve. He looked from Alessandro to the simple wooden crucifix on his wall. "The sin was not in their weakness, but in his pride," he murmured, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and burgeoning conviction. Lorenzo Bellucci was a tyrant who wore the mask of piety. He believed himself an instrument of God's will, a man entitled to mete out judgment. Don Leo's eyes met Alessandro's, and for the first time, the engineer saw not a frightened clergyman, but a man preparing for his own final penance. His power did not die with him, Alessandro. It lives in the fear he planted, a fear his family still cultivates. But your presence here, it has forced a reckoning. Your life is in danger now because of what I failed to do. The silence must end tonight. That Sunday, the Church of Santa Maria Assunta was fuller than it had been in years. A palpable tension hung in the air, thick with unspoken questions. The news of a special mass for the lost sons of Rockemont had spread like wildfire. Alessandro sat in the front pew, a stoic anchor in a sea of nervous faces. Beside him, clutching a worn rosary, was Sophia Gallo, her frail body radiating a strength that shamed the generations of silence. In the back, standing with his arms crossed, was Marco Bellucci, his face a mask of contemptuous rage. Marshal Vattimo stood discreetly near the side entrance, a silent observer waiting for a truth he could finally record. When Don Leo ascended the pulpit, a hush fell over the congregation. He did not open with a prayer, but with a confession. "My children," he began, his voice amplified by the church's solemn acoustics, "I have been your priest for many years. I have baptized your children and buried your parents. But I have carried a secret that has poisoned the soul of this town, a sin of silence." He held up the old parish register, its pages yellowed with age. "Clausi in silentio," he read, his voice clear and unwavering. "Closed in silence." These are the words written beside the names of 21 of our sons. We were told they were transferred. That was a lie to hide a monstrous truth. A collective gasp rippled through the pews. Marco Bellucci took a step forward, his knuckles white. "In 1871, Donna Leo continued, his gaze sweeping over his flock, Lorenzo Bellucci, the benefactor of the new chapel, saw impurities in the young novices. He imposed upon them a brutal penance of isolation and fasting, seeking to forge them into his own image of piety. When typhus began to spread among their weakened bodies, he did not see a tragedy. He saw divine judgment against the unworthy. Sophia began to weep silently, her grief a testament to the priest's words. Instead of seeking aid, Donna Leo's voice cracked with emotion, he saw an opportunity to contain what he called a spiritual plague. He, with the complicity of my predecessor, who was too weak to defy him, sealed them within the walls of that unfinished chapel. He sealed them in with their sickness and their fear, leaving them to die. He then used his wealth and influence to force this town into a vow of silence, a vow that has been kept for 50 years out of fear, a fear that his great-grandson tried to use against this man here. He pointed directly at Alessandro. The Bellucci legacy is not one of faith, but of terror. The dam of silence broke. A wail rose from an elderly man in the middle pews. "My uncle," they said, "he ran away." Another woman cried out, "My grandfather always told me not to go near that place." The church erupted in a chorus of grief and anger, the hushed rumors of generations finally given voice. Marco Bellucci, his face pale with fury and humiliation, turned and stormed out of the church, the collective gaze of the townspeople following him like a verdict. In the days that followed, Rocamont transformed. The fear was replaced by a shared, painful mourning. Marshal Vattimo, armed with Don Elio's public testimony, officially closed the case. There was no living person to prosecute, but the truth was recorded for posterity. The names of the 21 novices were etched onto a new marble plaque. Alessandro stood in the town cemetery, watching as the last of the small caskets was lowered into consecrated ground. Sophia Gallo, supported by her neighbors, placed a single white rose on the fresh earth that covered her brother Pietro. Don Elio performed the final rites, his voice no longer burdened by secrets, but filled with a quiet, solemn peace. His work was done. He had come to Rocamont to survey a structure of stone and mortar, but he left having mapped the foundations of a town's soul. As his car drove away, Alessandro looked back at the small mountain town, no longer a place of hostile silence, but one of difficult, heartbreaking, and ultimately healing truth.